Salvatore Toto Riina earned the infamous nickname, the Beast, La Belva, not by chance, but through a long, calculated career of unrelenting violence and fear. This name wasn't a media invention, it was bestowed upon him even by his fellow mafiosi, who viewed his actions as extreme, even by mafia standards. Riina was not just another mafia boss trying to protect his territory or business. He was a man driven by the belief that power must be achieved and maintained through absolute fear and merciless bloodshed. He didn't believe in negotiation, diplomacy, or alliances unless they were based on total submission. His leadership was defined by a scorched-earth approach: eliminate anyone who poses a threat, even if that person is a judge, politician, journalist, or fellow mobster. Riina's philosophy was simple and terrifying: kill first, and send a message. Under his command, executions were not just tactical, they were psychological weapons meant to paralyze society and remind everyone that no one was beyond his reach. Unlike traditional mafia bosses who preferred to operate in the shadows and avoid drawing public attention, Riina embraced terror as a public performance. He ordered the deaths of high-profile anti-mafia crusaders like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in broad daylight, knowing full well the national outrage it would provoke. But that was part of his message. No one, not even the most protected or revered figures in Italy, was safe. Riina's brutality also extended within the mafia ranks. He ordered the killing of rival bosses, their families, and even former allies, ensuring that fear would silence dissent. His rise to power was paved with internal purges, making it clear that loyalty to Riina was a matter of survival, not choice. His actions redefined the public image of the mafia, from a secretive criminal fraternity with codes of honor to a militarized, terror-driven force. In the eyes of the public and the Italian state, Riina was no longer just a criminal. He was a domestic warlord, leading a criminal insurgency against the very fabric of democracy and law. Salvatore Riina's journey from a poverty-stricken boy in rural Sicily to the most feared mafia boss in Italian history is a grim testament to how crime can flourish in the cracks of desperation and neglect. Born in 1930 in the small Sicilian town of Corleone, Riina's early life was defined by scarcity, hardship, and violence. His father died in a tragic accident while attempting to build a homemade bomb, an incident that left young Salvatore as the de facto head of a broken household, burdened with the responsibilities of survival in a lawless and unforgiving environment. In the post-war years, Sicily was a land ravaged by economic despair and social unrest. In this chaos, the mafia offered both structure and opportunity to those with the cunning and ruthlessness to rise through its ranks. For Riina, who had few prospects and no formal education, the criminal underworld became his only path to power. He joined the local mafia as a teenager and quickly distinguished himself, not through loyalty or strategy, but through his willingness to kill without hesitation. By the 1960s and 1970s, Riina had aligned himself with Luciano Leggio, another Corleone native who would later become his mentor and eventual predecessor. Under Leggio's direction, the Corleonese clan began a brutal internal war within the Sicilian Mafia. Unlike the older Palermo-based mafia families that favored discretion and a level of diplomacy, the Corleonese brought a new level of violence to the table, an approach that suited Riina perfectly. He thrived in bloodshed and quickly emerged as the clan's most feared enforcer. When Leggio was imprisoned, Riina seized the opportunity and took full control of the Corleonese. Under his command, the clan launched a full-scale assault on rival mafia factions during what became known as the Second Mafia War in the early 1980s. It was during this time that Riina solidified his position, not just as a clan leader, but as the undisputed boss of all bosses in Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia's central organization. He achieved this by ruthlessly eliminating any rival power structure. Judges, police officials, rival mob bosses, even close associates, were hunted down and executed with clinical precision. Riina's ascent was not just about climbing the criminal ladder, it was about redefining the hierarchy entirely. Where older mafia leaders operated within a framework of tradition and respect, Riina operated through fear and dominance, turning the mafia into a top-down dictatorship centered on his absolute authority. His rise marked a turning point in the mafia's history, transforming it from a loose federation of criminal families into a centralized killing machine, with Corleone and Riina at its heart. Salvatore Riina's reign of terror was marked by an almost mechanical reliance on assassination as a means of governance. He saw murder not as a last resort, but as a primary strategy, a form of communication, punishment, and consolidation of power. Estimates suggest that during his time at the top of the Sicilian Mafia hierarchy, Riina ordered or authorized the killings of over 150 individuals, possibly even more. This staggering number places him among the most prolific orchestrators of murder in modern European history. Riina's targets were not chosen randomly. They were part of a deliberate strategy to eliminate any threat, whether it came from within the mafia or from the outside world. Internally, he purged Cosa Nostra of rivals and dissenters, especially those who belonged to older, more traditional mafia families in Palermo and other Sicilian cities. He viewed anyone who challenged his authority, or even hinted at opposition, as a liability. Entire rival clans were exterminated. Family members of suspected traitors were also targeted, including women and children, to send a chilling message. Betrayal meant obliteration, not just for the individual, but for their bloodline. Externally, Riina launched a full-scale assault on the Italian state. Judges, prosecutors, police commissioners, and anti-mafia officials were placed on what was effectively a hit list. His philosophy was rooted in the idea that if you kill enough of your enemies, others will stop trying. This doctrine led to some of the most heinous acts in Italian criminal history. Perhaps most emblematic of his ruthlessness were the high-profile murders of magistrates Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two fearless prosecutors who had dedicated their lives to dismantling the mafia. Riina ordered their assassinations in 1992 through massive car bomb attacks that also claimed the lives of their bodyguards and bystanders. The killings shocked the nation and the world, revealing the terrifying extent of mafia influence and Riina's unflinching willingness to strike against the very symbols of justice. Journalists who dared to investigate the mafia's dealings were also in constant danger. Some were killed, others threatened or silenced through intimidation. Riina understood that controlling the narrative was as vital as controlling the streets. Information, if unchecked, could empower the public and stir resistance. So he made sure that those who wielded words as weapons were treated just as ruthlessly as those who carried guns. These killings weren't just meant to eliminate threats, they were designed to instill widespread fear. Every murder under Riina's command was a calculated act of terrorism, serving a dual purpose: removing an obstacle and reinforcing the myth of the mafia's invincibility. His cruelty was not hidden in shadows, it was broadcast, whispered, and feared. In many Sicilian towns, the silence of the streets was not peace, it was the sound of people too afraid to speak, to act, or even to hope for justice. Salvatore Riina's grip on the Sicilian Mafia ushered in what is widely regarded as the most violent and chaotic period in the long and deadly history of organized crime in Italy. The 1980s and 1990s under Riina's control weren't just years of criminal expansion, they were years of all-out war. Not only did the number of murders skyrocket, but the nature of those killings, brazen, public, and deliberately theatrical, signaled a dramatic shift in how the mafia operated under his command. Historically, the mafia had maintained a code of relative discretion. Killings were often silent, targeted, and covered up with a cloak of secrecy. But Riina tore up that code. He believed in open brutality as a means of control. Under his leadership, the Cosa Nostra became a militarized force of terror that didn't just kill to survive, it killed to dominate. The Second Mafia War, which exploded in the early 1980s, became the signature conflict of Riina's rise. It was an internal mafia civil war, but its scale rivaled that of national armed conflicts. The Corleone clan, under Riina, declared war on rival families, especially those from Palermo. Over the course of a few years, hundreds of mafiosi were slaughtered, not just men in suits and guns, but their wives, sons, brothers, and close associates. Bodies were found riddled with bullets, dismembered, or disappeared entirely. Murders occurred in restaurants, hospitals, even during weddings and funerals. No place was safe. What made this era even more terrifying was the mafia's growing appetite for political violence. Riina extended the battlefield beyond Sicily and into the heart of the Italian state. He sanctioned high-profile bombings in major cities like Rome, Milan, and Florence in the early 1990s. These attacks were intended to terrorize the Italian government into reducing pressure on Cosa Nostra, particularly after the passage of stricter anti-mafia laws. The bombings not only caused mass panic, but also destroyed cultural landmarks and claimed the lives of innocent civilians, escalating the mafia's war from the shadows into the public square. Law enforcement, overwhelmed and under-resourced, was often left struggling to keep up. Riina's operatives had infiltrated police forces, political offices, and even the judiciary, making it difficult to prosecute crimes or dismantle networks. The result was a sense of national despair, especially in Sicily, where trust in the state had always been fragile. People lived in fear, not just of being killed, but of being seen talking to the wrong person or asking the wrong question. During these years, Sicily became a war zone without declaration. The murders were not just high in number, they were psychologically destructive. Riina's message was consistent: obedience or death. In this climate, even those who wanted to resist felt helpless. Entire communities were paralyzed, bound by the silent terror that Riina and his regime had carefully engineered. Salvatore Riina's leadership represented a fundamental shift in the mafia's relationship with the Italian government. While previous generations of mafia leaders had operated in the shadows, seeking to quietly infiltrate state institutions and avoid direct confrontation, Riina adopted a radically different, and far more dangerous, approach. He chose to challenge the state head-on, launching a full-scale public war against the institutions of law and order in Italy. His strategy was not subtle, it was loud, violent, and relentless. To Riina, the Italian government was no longer simply an external obstacle or a force to be bribed or manipulated, it was an enemy to be crushed. This mindset led to a campaign of terror that shocked the world and destabilized the very foundations of Italian democracy. The war he waged included the calculated use of car bombings, targeted killings, and mass civilian casualties, tactics more commonly associated with terrorism than with organized crime. One of Riina's most infamous declarations of war came in the form of the 1992 assassination of Judge Giovanni Falcone, one of Italy's most prominent anti-mafia prosecutors. The attack, known as the Capaci bombing, was a turning point in modern Italian history. Riina's men packed half a ton of explosives beneath a section of highway near Palermo. When Falcone's convoy drove over it, the blast tore the road apart, killed Falcone, his wife, and 3 bodyguards, and left a crater that symbolized the mafia's violent challenge to the rule of law. Just 57 days later, Riina ordered the killing of another anti-mafia magistrate, Paolo Borsellino, in a similarly gruesome bombing in central Palermo. These acts were more than assassinations, they were statements. Riina was sending a clear message: anyone who stood against him, no matter how powerful, respected, or protected, would be destroyed. The killings were meticulously planned to occur in public, ensuring maximum media coverage and psychological impact. The Italian people were forced to witness the murder of their nation's most courageous figures in real time, and the fear that followed was deep and paralyzing. But Riina did not stop with magistrates. He expanded his war to include politicians, police officials, and even ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire. In the early 1990s, his strategy became more desperate and more catastrophic. When the state refused to negotiate or lessen its crackdown on the mafia, Riina escalated his tactics to include urban bombings in mainland Italy. In 1993, coordinated attacks were carried out in Rome, Milan, and Florence, targeting cultural landmarks like the Uffizi Gallery and historic churches. These bombings killed and injured dozens of civilians, including children, and marked an unprecedented level of violence in Italy's post-war history. The use of indiscriminate terror was a radical departure from the mafia's traditional methods. Riina was attempting to force the Italian state into submission, to make the cost of fighting the mafia so unbearable that politicians would back down and law enforcement would retreat. He believed fear could overwhelm law, and that death could bend democracy. Among the many brutal crimes orchestrated by Salvatore Riina, none shocked the conscience of Italy more deeply than the murders of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. These 2 men were not only high-profile magistrates, they were national heroes, symbols of resistance against decades of mafia corruption, violence, and silence. Their assassinations marked the most profound moments of Riina's war against the Italian state, turning him from a feared criminal into the embodiment of a national crisis. Falcone and Borsellino were both born in Palermo, grew up in the same neighborhood, and dedicated their lives to dismantling the grip of Cosa Nostra over Sicily. As magistrates, they developed groundbreaking investigative techniques that cut through the layers of mafia secrecy. They built alliances across borders, coordinated closely with law enforcement, and, perhaps most importantly, created legal frameworks that allowed prosecutors to use mafia turncoats, pentiti, as witnesses, a move that previously would have been unthinkable in a culture dominated by omerta, the code of silence. Falcone was especially instrumental in organizing the Maxi trial of 1986-87, the largest anti-mafia trial in Italian history. Based on hundreds of testimonies and thousands of pieces of evidence, the trial resulted in the conviction of over 300 mafiosi, dealing a massive blow to the organization. Riina saw Falcone's efforts not only as a direct threat, but as a betrayal of the mafia's untouchable myth. To him, Falcone wasn't just an enemy. He was a man who had pierced the mafia's armor. And for that, Riina marked him for death. On May 23, 1992, Falcone was traveling with his wife and bodyguards from the Palermo airport when a massive bomb, containing over 400 kilograms of explosives, was detonated beneath the highway near Capaci. The explosion was so powerful it created a crater and flung vehicles into the air like toys. Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 of his police escorts were killed instantly. It was not just an assassination, it was a declaration of terror, carried out with military precision. Just 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's closest friend and colleague, was murdered in a similarly brutal attack. While visiting his mother in Palermo, a car bomb was detonated as he approached her apartment building. The explosion killed Borsellino and 5 members of his police escort. The speed and brutality with which Riina followed one murder with another demonstrated his determination to eliminate any symbol of resistance. He wanted to break the morale of those who believed the mafia could be defeated. These assassinations shook Italy to its core. Millions took to the streets in grief and outrage. Schools, universities, public offices, all over Italy, held moments of silence. The people of Sicily, long bound by fear and silence, began to speak out in unprecedented numbers. Children painted signs. Women marched. Clergy and judges condemned the mafia from the pulpits and benches. The deaths of Falcone and Borsellino became a turning point in Italian history, not just because of the scale of the violence, but because of who they were and what they represented. They weren't just lawmen, they were symbols of hope in a land where justice had long been held hostage by corruption and blood. Their sacrifice became a rallying cry for a nation that had, for too long, tiptoed around the mafia's shadow. Salvatore Riina's arrest in January 1993 marked a pivotal moment in the long battle between the Italian state and the Sicilian Mafia. For over 2 decades, Riina had been a ghost in the criminal underworld, a man whose influence was felt in every corner of Sicily but whose face had all but vanished from the public eye. Despite orchestrating countless murders and operating at the center of one of the world's most dangerous criminal networks, he managed to live in complete freedom, shielded by an intricate web of fear, silence, and loyalty. Riina had become Italy's most wanted man by the early 1980s, yet he remained untouchable. The police knew his name, they knew his crimes, but they couldn't catch him. He didn't flee the country or hide in the mountains. Instead, he lived in Palermo itself, right in the heart of the territory he ruled with an iron fist. Protected by layers of loyal mafia operatives, corrupt officials, and an unspoken terror that gripped the local population, Riina was able to evade capture in broad daylight. He lived under assumed identities, rarely used phones, and relied on face-to-face communication, which made him virtually invisible to traditional law enforcement methods. His capture came not through brute force, but through persistent, painstaking investigation. Italian authorities, galvanized by the public outrage following the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino, had begun to overhaul their anti-mafia efforts. Dedicated units were formed, informants were cultivated, and advanced surveillance tactics were implemented. One of the major breakthroughs came from inside the mafia itself, as a growing number of pentiti, former mafia members turned state witnesses, began to cooperate with prosecutors. These insiders slowly peeled back the layers of Riina's empire, revealing just how deeply he had embedded himself within Palermo's urban landscape. On January 15, 1993, in a quiet residential neighborhood, Carabinieri officers pulled over a car driven by Riina's personal driver, Salvatore Biondino. Riina was in the passenger seat. He was arrested without resistance, his silence and composure almost eerie given the scale of the terror he had inflicted over the decades. It was a moment that stunned the nation, not only because he had finally been captured, but because of how ordinary the scene was. There was no shootout, no escape attempt, no grand gesture, just a short, quiet arrest of the man behind some of the most horrific crimes in Italian history. Riina's arrest sent shockwaves through the mafia. It dismantled the myth of his invincibility and opened the door to a flood of new investigations. Law enforcement raided the apartment he had been living in, a modest, nondescript building that had served as his hideout for years. Inside, they found documents, weapons, and evidence of continued mafia operations. Contrary to public perception, Riina had not been retired or weakened. He had been actively commanding killings, extortion, and strategy from behind the walls of that seemingly normal Palermo flat. For the Italian public, his arrest was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. After decades of bloodshed, the man responsible had finally been brought to justice. But it also raised questions. How had he evaded capture for so long? Who had protected him? What did it say about the depth of mafia influence in Sicilian society and within the institutions meant to fight it? Salvatore Riina's arrest in 1993 was a seismic event in the Italian justice system, but contrary to public hopes, it did not immediately sever his grip on the Sicilian Mafia. Remarkably, even after being locked away in a high-security prison under Italy's strict 41-bis prison regime, designed specifically to isolate mafia bosses, Riina was still believed to be issuing orders from behind bars. This lingering power revealed just how deeply he had embedded himself in the infrastructure and psychology of Cosa Nostra, and how difficult it was to dismantle the empire he had built. The 41-bis regime, often referred to as carcere duro, or hard prison, was created to cut off high-ranking mafiosi from their criminal networks. It imposed solitary confinement, restricted visitation rights, monitored all correspondence, and even limited contact with lawyers. Riina was subjected to this regime in an attempt to neutralize his influence. Yet reports continued to surface that messages, known in mafia circles as pizzini, small, handwritten notes, were being smuggled in and out of the prison system, enabling Riina to communicate with his loyalists on the outside. Italian prosecutors and investigators, including those involved in the nationwide anti-mafia efforts, believed that Riina continued to exert a strategic, almost symbolic leadership role. While he may not have been involved in the day-to-day operations or minor decisions, his authority was still seen as sacrosanct by many within the organization. Younger bosses looked up to him as the ultimate example of fear-based leadership, and many considered his approval necessary for major actions, particularly acts of violence or retaliation. His continued relevance wasn't only operational, it was ideological. In numerous intercepted conversations between mafia members during the late 1990s and early 2000s, Riina's name was invoked with both reverence and caution. Some feared him even while imprisoned, others sought to preserve his legacy. What made this even more dangerous was the perception that Riina's imprisonment had elevated his status, turning him into a sort of mythical figure, an untouchable martyr for the cause of mafia supremacy. His unrepentant attitude during court appearances only added to this mystique. He never cooperated with authorities, never expressed remorse, and never showed signs of weakness. In the eyes of some mafiosi, this made him a hero. Adding to these concerns were alleged plots and discussions about continued violence, some of which emerged from wiretaps of other imprisoned mobsters. In one particularly chilling incident, a 2013 prison recording captured Riina speaking to another inmate about his enduring hatred for Judge Nino Di Matteo, a prosecutor involved in high-profile anti-mafia investigations. Riina was heard threatening Di Matteo, suggesting that a nice explosion would be the only way to silence him. This incident confirmed that Riina, well into his 80s, remained ideologically committed to the mafia's violent principles and, more disturbingly, that his voice still carried weight among those willing to act. Riina's ongoing influence, even while incarcerated, illustrated the depth of loyalty and fear he had cultivated during his decades in power. Unlike other mob bosses who faded into obscurity or cooperated with the state in exchange for leniency, Riina stayed silent, defiant, and deadly. He became more than a leader. He became a symbol of what it meant to be mafia in its most brutal form. For many, even in prison, Riina was still il capo dei capi, the boss of bosses. Salvatore Riina's years at the helm of Cosa Nostra did more than stain Sicily with blood. They peeled back the curtain on just how deeply the mafia had infiltrated the very heart of Italian society. Riina's reign revealed a disturbing symbiosis between organized crime and the state, where political alliances, institutional complicity, and systemic silence allowed the mafia to thrive for decades. Under his leadership, the line between criminal enterprise and political influence became dangerously blurred, and for many Italians, this revelation was as alarming as the violence itself. For years, Riina and the Corleone clan leveraged fear and bribery to manipulate public officials, secure protection from law enforcement, and influence elections. The mafia's strategy wasn't just about operating in the shadows, it was about embedding itself within the very institutions designed to stop it. Local mayors, police officers, judges, and members of parliament were often either intimidated into compliance or willingly partnered with mafia operatives in exchange for votes, money, or favors. Riina elevated this model to an art form, turning Cosa Nostra into a parallel state with its own rules, economy, and enforcement mechanisms. One of the most shocking consequences of his dominance was the exposure of il patto stato mafia, the alleged secret negotiations between elements of the Italian state and the mafia during the early 1990s. Following the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, a controversial theory emerged that representatives of the government may have opened clandestine communication channels with mafia bosses in an effort to end the wave of terrorist-style bombings plaguing the country. These so-called state mafia pacts suggested that the mafia might halt its attacks in exchange for relaxed prison conditions and legal concessions, an idea that sparked public outrage and deeply damaged faith in Italy's democratic integrity. Ongoing investigations into these alleged backroom deals, some of which persisted well into the 2010s, revealed the extent of political vulnerability to mafia influence. Riina, even while under lock and key, was often at the center of this discourse. His name came up in trials, depositions, and wiretaps, raising the specter of whether high-ranking officials had colluded, either directly or indirectly, with the most violent criminal in Italian history. The chilling implication was that Riina's power had not merely been allowed to grow, it had been tolerated or even enabled by those sworn to protect the public. Furthermore, Riina's control exposed the fragility of public institutions in southern Italy, especially in regions where unemployment, poverty, and lack of government support left people vulnerable to mafia influence. Cosa Nostra under Riina filled the void that the state often left behind, offering jobs, settling disputes, and maintaining order in the communities it dominated. While this made the mafia appear like a provider to some, it also made clear that state failure was a major reason the mafia remained so entrenched. The result of this revelation was a deep erosion of public trust, not just in Sicily but across the entire nation. Italians began to question the very foundations of their justice system, their police force, and their elected officials. If Riina had succeeded in turning criminal violence into political leverage, how safe was anyone truly? If the mafia could manipulate courts, silence journalists, and corrupt lawmakers, then what hope was there for ordinary citizens trying to live honest lives? This climate of mistrust would shape Italy for years to come. Protests, reform movements, and civic outrage followed in the wake of Riina's rise and exposure. Italians demanded transparency, justice, and institutional cleansing, but the scars left by Riina's revelations would take generations to heal. Although Salvatore Riina was captured in 1993 and sentenced to multiple life terms, his imprisonment did not end the fear he instilled across Sicily. In fact, for many, his incarceration only shifted the form of his menace, from physical violence on the streets to a more psychological and institutional presence. Riina's name remained a chilling symbol of absolute mafia authority, and his legacy lingered like a ghost in the corridors of power, in the minds of former enemies, and among those who had once served him. Despite being confined to a maximum security prison under the strict 41 bis regime, a law specifically designed to cut mafia leaders off from their networks, Riina was far from silenced. Intelligence reports, intercepted conversations, and testimonies revealed that he continued to issue threats, express loyalty to violence, and possibly even try to influence mafia dynamics from his cell. His recorded statements, filled with bravado and disdain for the state, reminded Italians that Riina was not a man easily broken. In one infamous wiretap, he boasted about how Falcone and Borsellino got what they deserved, sending shivers through the public and reigniting painful memories of the past. Riina's presence behind bars also preserved his myth within certain criminal circles. Among younger mafiosi, his name evoked a kind of dark respect. He was spoken of as a man who had defied the state, eliminated rivals with surgical precision, and enforced a brutal code of loyalty. For some, he became a model of what a true boss should be, unyielding, ruthless, and dominant even from prison. His continued influence over the mafia's culture of fear meant that silence and omerta, the mafia code of silence, still thrived, especially in towns where his reign had left deep scars. In the villages and small towns of Sicily, families who had suffered under Riina's rule continued to live in fear, not just of reprisals, but of what might happen if the Corleonesi ever tried to reclaim their former power. Businesses remained cautious about speaking out. Investigative journalists still received threats. Politicians treaded carefully when discussing past mafia-state links. The psychological grip of Riina's era continued to mold local behavior, creating an invisible but persistent barrier to open defiance. Moreover, the Italian justice system found itself constantly revisiting Riina's legacy. Trials linked to his past commands, appeals from his family, and legal debates about his prison conditions regularly surfaced in national headlines. Each time Riina's name appeared, it served as a stark reminder of how deeply his crimes had penetrated Italian society, and how unfinished the story really was. His ongoing legal entanglements, not just for murders already adjudicated, but also for alleged involvement in unsolved crimes, kept his shadow alive in the courtroom and in the public imagination. Riina's continued relevance even influenced debates about prison reform, particularly surrounding the harsh conditions of the 41 bis regime. Human rights organizations sometimes raised concerns about his treatment, citing issues like solitary confinement and denied medical access. However, any sympathy was often met with anger by victims' families and the broader public, who viewed Riina not as a prisoner, but as a monster who had brought Italy to its knees. The very idea that he might deserve humane treatment became a deeply divisive issue, reflecting the moral complexity his name still carried. And then there was his family. Riina's children, especially his son Giuseppe Salvatore Riina, sought to establish lives for themselves in the shadow of their father's notorious legacy. Giuseppe, once convicted of mafia-related crimes, later claimed to have left that life behind, even becoming an author. Yet many Italians questioned whether the Riina name could ever be truly separated from its violent history. Every public appearance or statement from the Riina family rekindled old wounds, casting fresh scrutiny on whether the sins of the father could ever be disentangled from the identity of the children.